He to whom the portentous conspiracy of night and solitude and silence in the heart of a great forest is not an unknown experience, needs not to be told what another world it all is. How even the most commonplace and familiar objects take on another character. The trees group themselves differently. They draw closer together as if in fear. The very silence has another quality than the silence of the day, and it is full of half-heard whispers, whispers that startle, ghosts of sounds long dead. There are living sounds, too, such as are never heard under other conditions. Notes of strange night birds, the cries of small animals in sudden encounters with stealthy foes or in their dreams, a rustling in the dead leaves. It may be the leap of a wood rat. It may be the footfall of a panther. What caused the breaking of that twig? What the low, alarming twittering of that bush full of birds? There are sounds without a name, forms without substance, translations in space of objects which have not been seen to move, movements wherein nothing is observed to change its place. Ah, children of the sunlight and the gaslight, how little you know of the world in which you live. So that was a passage from Ambrose Bierce. This is the Library of America edition. That was from the story The Tough Tussle. Now, I had read in early October Bierce's collection, and I really, really liked it. I am talking today about this book and a couple of other books that I have read. This is another edition of Fresh Read Kills. That is a series in which I talk about the books that I have recently read. So I'm going to talk about Bierce, I'm going to talk about this one here, The Rural Gothic in American Popular Culture, and The Man of the Crowd, Edgar Allan Poe in the City. These three books I finished in the first half of October. I'm coming to you today on Halloween Day. I'm celebrating with an Exorcist shirt. It's the last day of October. I am not very good about filming updates as I finish things. I kind of do a bunch of videos at once and then just kind of release them over a short period of time. So you're going to see quite a few videos in a row with me wearing the Exorcist shirt. So that explains it. I'm going to be making another video for Fresh Read Kills in which I'll talk about the second half of the month and the books that I finished then. So I'm going to get back to Bierce, but first I will talk about the first book that I read actually in October, and that is this, The Man of the Crowd, Edgar Allan Poe in the City by Scott Peeples. This is from Princeton University Press. I had been planning to read this anyway for Historathon, which is a year-long event where we read nonfiction history. We have split up the year into 4 quarters, and this last quarter, last 3 months, looks at 1822, the present day. This also coincided by coincidence with another event that was going on in the booktube world. It was October. That was created by Erica over at Passage of Time and Al at Big Hard Books and Classics. So they are basically, reading as a group read Edgar Allan Poe, but also reading some things that are about Poe. Now, I wasn't going to read any Poe in October because I read his complete works a few years ago, and I was instead focusing on the short stories of Bierce this month. But I did already have this planned, and it fit along nicely with their event. So what Scott Peeples is looking at here are the cities in which Poe, the various cities that he called home, at least for a short time. Poe never really had a home. He never really had a permanent home. But he would live in various cities on the East Coast. And Scott Peeples looks at, for each city, let me go to the content, you can see what cities he's talking about here. We've got Richmond, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. And there are also some photographs throughout that are very helpful. Some of them are composite photographs. Like if you kind of look at this one on the top, it's a composite of an archival photograph basically superimposed with what's there today. So you can see what it was like in Poe's time, and if you go to visit the location, you can see what it's like now. But it has nice, helpful images throughout here. And each time he talks about a city, he gives us a snapshot of what the city was like during that time, the first half of the 1800s. Then we get into what Poe was pretty much up to, and then how those experiences of the city might have influenced Poe's writing. And some of that stuff is actually pretty interesting. it did give me a little more insight into things like Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first real detective story, but how that is a story that only works in the city. You have an apartment building where you have people all speaking different languages. You know, it's a very urban story, and essentially what I'm getting at here. So we have insights like that, and I think Peeples does a good job with this. I enjoyed this quite a bit. It's a fairly quick read. Poe is somebody who is undoubtedly a genius, but he was also very self-destructive. You know, Peeples rightly basically brings up the story Imp of the Perverse as this self-destructive tendency, and Poe seemed to have it. Just when things were going well for him, he figured out ways to somehow screw it up. But still, a fascinating person. You know, the amazing amount of stories that he came out with, and so many of them are so good, so memorable, so classic. You know, even if you're not somebody who's ever read Poe before, you probably know some of his stories and might not even realize it. But Poe also, he didn't just write horror, so it goes into some other types of books that Poe read. I'm sorry, not read, that he wrote. He wrote satire, he wrote, you know, criticism. He wrote quite a few different realms. And a lot of it most of it is, I would say, at least pretty good. But yeah, this was, again, a fun, quick read. I really enjoyed it. Gave me more insight into Poe. And I am somebody who, whenever I go to a city, if there is a Poe location, I do try to actually check it out. So I'm one of those kind of tourists who like to see some literary spots. I'm not obsessed with it, but somebody like Poe, I will go out of my way if I'm in a city to see something connected to him. I have done that in New York before. So this is also a little bit of a travel guide as well that you can use it for. So that was the first thing that I read in October. And then I moved on to Bierce. This is part of my Gothic reads. I guess it also does align with Victober, the year-long booktube event where, yearly booktube long, not year-long, yearly booktube event where people basically read Victorian literature. It's very popular on booktube. I didn't read it for that reason. It was kind of already coming up on my list of Gothic works that I wanted to read. But Bierce did fit along pretty nicely with that. Now, Bierce, he's a fairly interesting guy. I mean, he was in the Civil War, and he saw he was in some of the worst battles. He was actually got a pretty bad head injury in the war that affected him throughout the rest of his life. He ended up becoming, after the war, a very influential journalist. And of course, he was a writer of short stories and satirical works as well. And then in the early 1900s, he went down to Mexico during the Mexican Civil War to report on what was happening, and he was never heard from again. He was an old man by that point, but still. Mysterious death. We don't know what happened to him. So, you know, it's kind of Poe had his own mysterious death. We knew where he was, but we don't know what happened to him in those last days and why he was wearing clothes that didn't fit him and why he was in such a stupor. So there's a mystery surrounding his death, and there's also a mystery surrounding Bierce's death. And I do think that Bierce is somebody who is maybe not discussed nearly enough. His satire is fantastic. Now, I had known about Bierce through his work, The Devil's Dictionary. I have a paperback copy of that from Dover Press, and I consider that the ultimate bathroom reader. It is basically, it has nothing to do with the devil, but it is a dictionary of witty, satirical definitions. And they're insightful, but also often quite funny. I just marked history because I'm such a history geek. He has history. An account mostly false of events mostly unimportant, which are brought about by rulers mostly knaves and soldiers mostly fools. Historian is a broad gauge gossip. A Hebrew, a male Jew, as distinguished from the Shebrew, an altogether superior creation. So it's funny wit. I mean, this is from the 19th century. It's from the 1800s, so a lot of it is going to be of its time. But still, I think that a lot of this satire really holds up, and it'll give you a good chuckle. So I knew it from that, and I was aware that he wrote dark stories. I had known about an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which is probably his most famous story, a Civil War tale that was also, I think, filmed as a French short film, which was then used as a Twilight Zone episode. And that's in his collection about soldiers and civilians. So this has that. That's the first collection that's in here. Short stories. The first half is about soldiers in the Civil War. The second half is about civilians. And then we have the collection in here, Can Such Things Be?, which is really his horror tales. They're mostly ghost stories. And we have some various other ghost stories in here that follow. Then we got the Devil's Dictionary. Then we have bits of autobiography, which I read some of those as well, especially his memories of Civil War battles. And then we have some other selected stories. Now, as you read through these, you can certainly start to see, a repetition, certain things occurring over and over again. We have a lot of people dying of fright in a lot of these stories. So there's a predictable nature sometimes, but I still really enjoyed them. I like his writing quite a bit. His descriptions are terrific. Some of the stories are really grim, and shockingly so. Now, this isn't even one of the horror stories, but I'm going to read. It's going to be obviously something of a spoiler, so I hope you don't mind. This is from his short story, Chickamauga, where he's writing about a child who lives on a plantation, and he goes off in the woods to play, and the kid gets lost, and then it gets dark, and he wakes up. He was sleeping in the woods, and he wakes up, and he notices that there are men crawling throughout the forest, a lot of times on their bellies or on all fours, and they're heading towards a river. And he sees this, but he's a child, and he doesn't quite understand what he is seeing. So here we go. I'm just going to read a paragraph of this. You'll kind of get a sense of the sorts of things. Remember, Bierce was a Civil War veteran, so he's probably saying some things that he might have witnessed or were plausible at least. So this is the child's perspective again. He saw but little, but that these were men, yet crept like babes. Being men, they were not terrible, though unfamiliarly clad. He moved among them freely, going from one to another and peering into their faces with childish curiosity. All their faces were singularly white, and many were streaked and gouted with red. Something in this, something too perhaps in their grotesque attitudes and movements, reminded him of the painted clown whom he had seen last summer in the circus, and he laughed as he watched them. But on and ever on they crept, these maimed and bleeding men, as heedless as he of the dramatic contrast between his laughter and their own ghastly gravity. To him it was a merry spectacle. He had seen his father's Negroes creep upon their hands and knees for his amusement, had ridden them so, making believe they were his horses. He now approached one of these crawling figures from behind, and with an agile movement mounted it astride. The man sank upon his breast, recovered, flung the small boy fiercely to the ground, as an unbroken colt might have done, then turned upon him a face that lacked a lower jaw. From the upper teeth to the throat was a great red gap, fringed with hanging shreds of flesh and splintered bone. The unnatural prominence of nose, the absence of chin, the fierce eyes, gave this man the appearance of a great bird of prey, crimsoned in throat and breast by the blood of his quarry. The man rose to his knees, the child to his feet. The man shook his fist at the child. The child, terrified at last, ran to a tree nearby, got upon the farther side of it, and took a more serious view of the situation. And so the clumsy multitude dragged itself slowly and painfully along in hideous pantomime, moved forward down the slope like a swarm of great black beetles, with never a sound of going, in silence profound, absolute. So again, that's not even one of his horror stories. That's not a ghost story. That is just a terrible sight. And we get things like that. We know that he saw some terrible things. He has one of his memories, what I saw at Shiloh. He talks about how a bunch of men, some of them wounded, they would have otherwise survived, but they are caught in a forest fire. I guess forest fires were pretty common actually during the war. So after this fire has gone through, he climbs down to the valley to see what's left, and he's basically walking like ankle deep in ash. And he talks about what he saw. So this is not fiction. This is actually an autobiographical account that I'll read really quickly. Forbidding enough it was in every way. The fire had swept every superficial foot of it, and at every step I sank in ashes to the ankle. It had contained a thick undergrowth of young saplings, every one of which had been severed by a bullet, the foliage of the prostrate tops being afterward burnt, and the stumps charred. Death had put his sickle into this thicket, and fire had gleaned the field, along a line which was not that of the extreme depression, but was at every point significantly equidistant from the heights. On either hand lay the bodies, half buried in ashes, some in the unlovely looseness of attitude, denoting sudden death by the bullet, but by far the greater number in postures of agony that told of the tormenting flame. Their clothes was half burnt away, their hair and beard entirely. The rain had come too late to save their nails. Some were swollen to double girth, others shriveled to mannequins. According to degree of exposure, their faces were bloated and black or yellow and shrunken. The contraction of muscles, which had given them claws for hands, had cursed each countenance with a hideous grin. Pho, I cannot catalogue the charms of these gallant gentlemen who had got what they enlisted for. So, we go from a horrible, terrifying fictional account to a horrible, terrifying nonfiction account of the war. I'll just comment really quickly on the ghost stories. I really enjoyed the ghost stories overall. There was an interesting theme that ran through most of them, at least the majority of them. They are so unlike a lot of the European ghost stories, maybe of the time or earlier. It's not crumbling castles or anything like that. These are ghosts of, I would say, transients. The ghosts are often people who had recently arrived, and there's traces of them having been there. And these traces are being found by people who have also newly arrived. So most of the ghosts, except for a few, they're not old souls who have been there for a long time. You can kind of imagine, the United States of the late 1800s, people on the move. But as you move through the country, you see evidence of people who have come before, the ghosts of the past. And that's what a lot of it kind of reminded me of. So I really like this a lot. I was quite impressed. I'd like to know more about Bierce himself. I liked his voice a lot. Sometimes you just kind of click with an author's voice and the kind of way that they describe things, or, you can get a glimpse of their perspective. And what I got from Bierce, I liked. So that is the second thing that I read. And I did this as a buddy read with, or at least one of the things, Can Such Things Be, the ghost stories, I did as a buddy read with Mark at Book Time with Elvis, and he said that he also really enjoyed those stories. And lastly, I'm going to discuss, really quickly, hopefully, because it's already going on for 18 minutes, The Rural Gothic in American Popular Culture, Backwoods Horror and Terror in the Wilderness by Bernice M. Murphy. This is from Palgrave Macmillan. I have a bunch of Palgrave books. I had gotten, a couple of years ago, they had an excellent sale where it was like, these books are generally expensive. We're talking close to $100 just for, even some paperbacks. And they had an excellent sale one year where it was like $5 for a paperback, $10 for a hardcover. So I stocked up on a bunch of them. And I'm glad that I did. I have read some essays by Bernice M. Murphy, and I also had read her previous book, which was The Suburban Gothic in American Popular Culture, which I really liked. She has an approach to horror studies, which of course this is, that I really like. Essentially looking at things within their historical context. What is going on at the time that maybe influenced why something was written a certain way, or is there something in like a past trauma historically that a text or a film is dealing with, and she does a really good job with that stuff, and I like this as well. I will say something about Palgrave itself, and this is not at all a reflection on Murphy. They have some excellent horror scholarship that they publish, but they have, I guess, really bad copy editors sometimes. I have yet to read I feel like a Palgrave book that did not have a lot of typos. And they're not like horrible things. It's just, they're distracting, where you have the twice, or it says if instead of. There's things like that occur, and they're too numerous to really be excusable. So I'm just putting it out there. I get the impression that Palgrave puts a lot of the copy editing stress on the author themselves, and I don't think that's really the way it should be, especially when you're charging as much as they do for these books, they should have a really good copy editor go through and make sure that everything is right. And they don't seem to do that. So it's one minor annoyance that I have with Palgrave. However, again, that does not reflect the actual scholarship. So Bernice M. Murphy, she's looking at, again, rural Gothic. I think today some of the stuff we could even fall into a folk horror category, which is not a term that was widely used when she published this in the early 2010s. And she looks at various texts. She actually looks at Charles Brockden Brown, especially Wieland, which I had read, was it earlier this year, maybe? Or late last year. But I had read that as part of my Gothic reads. So that's an American text, of course. And she looks at things like how the captivity narratives of the 1600s, like Mary Rowlandson, how they have kind of affected historical memory in Americans and how that has been reflected in horror and in Gothic literature, especially American Gothic literature. She finds certain tropes that are constantly repeated, like going all the way back to Rowlandson, having blood on the mouth is like a sign of basically becoming more savage, and we see that all the way up through modern horror cinema. She looks at things like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Young Goodman Brown, how in the early part of the book, it's most about like how the old world is contrasting with the new world. But then we have things about communities in the wilderness and how the forest seems to affect people who live near it. So she has things like, again, Hawthorne, Charles Brockden Brown, but she even looks at things like M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. We got things like, let's see, a really interesting actual conversation about The Shining, where she looks at The Shining through the lens of the Wendigo myth, which was quite interesting. And then speaking of Wendigo, she talks about one of a horror film that I really have a soft spot for that I like a lot, and that's Ravenous, about cannibals in the American frontier, right around the time of the Mexican-American War. I think that's a great fun kind of black humor comedy. Black comedy within the horror realm that I am really fond of. And we have things like the rural poors of the monstrous other. So everything from like Deliverance to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and even eco horror at the end. So yeah, I really enjoyed this quite a bit. She's definitely a horror scholar that I look out for, and that I hope to get more things by. So yeah, really had a good time with this one. So those are the first 3 books that I read in October. All of them, in one way or another, horror related. I talked a lot about Bierce, and I've talked a lot in this video. So the 3 that I read, again, were The Man of the Crowd by Edgar Allan Poe, The Rural Gothic in American Popular Culture, and finally, collected works of Ambrose Bierce in the Library of America edition. If you've read any of these, love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, booktube.